A Christmas at the Lake Cabin. Rediscovering family. The return to the cabin. Winter had turned the landscape into a frozen painting. The trees lining the road were covered in snow, and the sound of Elizabeth's car tires was muffled by the thick white layer on the ground. Her eyes were fixed on the narrow path leading to the cabin, a place she hadn't visited since her teenage years. It had been over 10 years since Elizabeth last set foot there. Back then, the cabin was the heart of her family's Christmas celebrations. She remembered the laughter, the warm nights by the fireplace, and the sweet aroma of gingerbread cookies her grandmother used to bake. But after her grandmother's passing and the ensuing disputes between her father and uncles, visits to the cabin had ceased, along with the spirit of family unity. Elizabeth was tired. Not just from the journey but from her life as a whole. As a writer, she had always found inspiration in the chaos of big cities, but something inside her had changed. In recent months, the words simply wouldn't come. Christmas, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cruel reminder of her family's emotional distance. "Maybe here I'll find some clarity," she murmured to herself as she parked the car beside the cabin. First moments at the cabin. Stepping out of the car, the biting cold immediately enveloped her. The cabin looked exactly as she remembered. Small lights still hung from the windows though they were unlit, and a wilted pine wreath still adorned the door. Elizabeth felt a knot in her stomach as she noticed how abandoned the place seemed, almost like a reflection of the disconnection she felt within her family. She unlocked the door with the old key her mother had sent her. The cabin's interior was dusty and dark, but the memories rushed back the moment she stepped inside. The stone fireplace in the corner was still there, bearing the marks of flames that had once warmed so many nights. The dining table still had the same red fabric runner her grandmother had sewn by hand. Elizabeth dropped her bags on the floor and began to explore. Each object seemed to whisper a memory. A box of Christmas ornaments was stacked in a corner, filled with delicate glass balls her grandmother had cherished. She opened the box and picked up one of the ornaments, its glass surface reflecting her face under the cabin's dim light. Her heart ached with nostalgia and longing as she stood there, the ornament in her hand reminding her of a time when life felt simpler and her family closer. Little did she know, this Christmas would be the start of something she hadn't dared to hope for. The chance to reconnect, to heal old wounds, and to rediscover the magic of family. "Just as I remembered." "It's exactly as I remembered," Elizabeth said aloud, but her voice echoed through the empty cabin, a stark reminder of her solitude. The lake and the first discovery. After unpacking her things, Elizabeth decided to walk to the lake, something she had often done as a child. The lake was completely frozen, and the surrounding landscape was so silent it felt suspended in time. It was an almost magical silence, but also unsettling. As she walked along the shore, something shiny caught her eye in the snow. Curious, she approached and found a small rusted metal box. It looked like it had been buried there for years, perhaps brought to the surface by the recent thaw. Elizabeth carefully opened the box and found several letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were dated decades ago and signed in her grandmother's delicate handwriting. The first lines read, "To my son." With her heart racing, Elizabeth tucked the letters away and hurried back to the cabin. These letters felt like a lost piece of her family's story, something that could fill the gaps she had always felt but never understood. A night with the past. Back at the cabin, Elizabeth lit the fireplace and sat on the rug, spreading the letters out before her. The first one was short but heavy with emotion. "Dear Tom, I know things are difficult right now. Christmas has always been our time of joy, but I feel like the weight of the world is pulling us apart. Please remember that this cabin is more than just a place. It is our home. It holds our memories and the love that has always bound our family. Promise me you'll never let that disappear. With love, Mom." Elizabeth held the letter tightly, feeling the weight of the words. Her father rarely spoke of the past or her grandmother. He always seemed burdened by something, a sadness he never explained. But this letter revealed a side of him she had never known. Outside, the wind began to howl, and the trees around the cabin swayed under the weight of the snow. Elizabeth felt a chill that seemed more emotional than physical. She looked around the room, noticing how alive the cabin felt with the fire crackling and the sounds of winter in the background. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt like it was waiting for her family, and for the love that had once made it a home. That's when she heard it. A soft sound, like the rustling of pages turning, coming from the next room. It must be the wind, she told herself, but the sound persisted, insistent. Elizabeth grabbed her flashlight and walked toward the room. The door was slightly ajar, and the air inside felt colder than the rest of the cabin. When she entered, she saw a pile of old books on the table. They were exactly as her grandmother had left them, but one book lay open, revealing a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "The Lost Christmas Reunion of 1975. The Truth Behind the Letters." Elizabeth held the newspaper clipping, trying to understand how it had ended up there. The edges were worn, but the text was still legible. The striking headline, "The Lost Christmas Reunion of 1975, was followed by a subtitle that sent a chill down her spine. Lake Cabin becomes the scene of family mysteries. She read carefully, the warmth of the fireplace in the other room seeming to vanish as the room around her grew colder. The Livingston family's traditional Christmas celebration was disrupted in 1975 when the matriarch, Margaret Livingston, mysteriously disappeared during the night. Despite extensive searches conducted by both family members and local authorities, no trace of Margaret was ever found. The cabin, once a symbol of familial unity, became the point of division among the siblings, leading to their estrangement. Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest. The mention of her grandmother's disappearance was something she had never been told. In fact, her family always spoke of Margaret as a loving and devoted woman, but they rarely mentioned Christmas 1975. It had always been a topic avoided, as if the date carried an unbearable weight. Her mind raced. The letters, the clipping, and the unspoken family history, everything seemed connected. Why had her father never told her about this? Why had the family chosen silence over truth? Elizabeth's eyes fell on the letters she had brought back to the room. The first one she had read suddenly took on a deeper meaning. Her grandmother's plea for unity and love now felt like a warning, as though Margaret had known something was coming. Elizabeth shivered, not just from the cold but from the sense that she was uncovering a story that her family had tried to bury. As the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked under its weight, she knew one thing for sure: this Christmas would be unlike any other. Elizabeth glanced around the room, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. The pile of books on the table seemed as if it had been placed there recently, but that was impossible. She was certain no one had visited the cabin in years. At the top of the pile was a small red journal. It was worn and weathered, with the name Margaret embossed in faded gold letters on the cover. Trembling, Elizabeth opened it to the first page, where a handwritten note read, "Christmas 1975. I hope this will be the most special one of all. Revisiting the past." Sitting once again by the fireplace, Elizabeth began reading the journal. The first pages were filled with joy and anticipation. Margaret wrote about decorating the cabin, the gifts she had prepared for her grandchildren, and her desire for that Christmas to be perfect. But as Elizabeth read further, the tone of the entries began to shift. December 21st, 1975. Something is wrong. Tom and Robert, my sons, have been arguing a lot. There's a tension I can't seem to dissolve no matter how hard I try. They don't see the importance of us being together. I feel that if we don't do something now, our family may be lost forever. December 24th, 1975. The night is strangely quiet. I can hear the wind outside, but there's something else. A presence? Perhaps it's just my tired mind, but it feels as though someone, or something, is trying to speak to me. Maybe it's my own heart, reminding me that I need to resolve my family's issues before it's too late. The last entry, dated December 25th, was short and incomplete. I have to do this now. If I can help my sons remember, maybe there's still time. The sentence trailed off abruptly, with a smudge of ink spread across the page. It was as if Margaret had been interrupted. An unsettling revelation. Elizabeth stared at the unfinished entry, her heart pounding. It was clear her grandmother had been deeply worried about the family's divisions. But what had she meant by "do this now"? What had happened that night to leave the journal incomplete and her family broken? The diary seemed to confirm the tension Margaret had hinted at in her letters. It also raised more questions than answers. Why had no one spoken of this? Why had Margaret's concerns been buried along with her disappearance? The wind howled louder outside, rattling the windows of the cabin. Elizabeth closed the journal and held it tightly, as if it could anchor her in the face of the growing mystery. She looked toward the shadowy corners of the room, feeling as though the cabin itself was urging her to uncover the truth. In that moment, Elizabeth resolved to piece together the events of Christmas 1975. The answers she sought were here, somewhere within the walls of the cabin, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps, in solving the mystery of her grandmother's disappearance, Elizabeth could find the reconciliation her family so desperately needed. The revelation of the letters. After reading the diary, Elizabeth turned her attention to the letters she had found by the lake. Her grandmother's handwriting was soft yet firm. Some of the letters were unfinished, while others seemed never to have been sent. All of them were addressed to her father, Tom. One letter in particular caught her eye. Unlike the others, which spoke of love and tradition, this one had a darker tone. Dear Tom, I know you hold resentment toward me. I'm sorry for all the times I failed to show how much you were loved. But please remember, Christmas is our bond. It's the one thing that has always united us, even when the world seemed to fall apart. The cabin is special, but it also carries something beyond us, a calling for those who have forgotten the value of what truly matters. Do not ignore this calling even if it frightens you. Please come to the cabin and see for yourself. Elizabeth stared at the words. A calling? She repeated softly, almost aloud. It was as if her grandmother had been trying to warn her father about something inexplicable, something that now seemed to be calling her as well. The sound in the night. As she reflected on everything, a strange noise interrupted her thoughts. It was a faint crackling sound coming from outside the cabin, followed by what sounded like footsteps in the snow. Elizabeth froze for a moment, clutching the diary tightly. It must be an animal, she thought, trying to calm herself. But the footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone were walking slowly around the cabin. She grabbed her flashlight and walked to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain to peer outside. The darkness was thick, but in the distance, near the lake, she saw something. A faint figure stood at the edge of the lake, barely visible among the trees. Who's there? She shouted, but her voice echoed into the silence without an answer. The figure didn't move. A shiver ran down her spine, and before she could react, the sound of something falling to the floor came from the bedroom. She hurried back, only to find Margaret's diary open to a new page as though someone had placed it there. The words in the center of the page were unmistakable. Find the hidden gift. It is the key to bring us back together. A new mission. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she read the words. The hidden gift? She murmured, her mind racing. What could her grandmother have meant? What gift could possibly unite her family after all these years? The cabin, the letters, the diary, and now this mysterious figure, it all seemed interconnected. Elizabeth knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something in the cabin was waiting to be discovered, and whatever it was, it held the answers she had come searching for. Taking a deep breath, she resolved to stay awake through the night. If the cabin had secrets, she was determined to uncover them, no matter what. The lost gift. Elizabeth stood frozen, staring at the open page of Margaret's diary. Find the hidden gift. It is the key to bring us back together. The words seemed to shimmer under the flickering firelight. Who or what had opened the diary to that page? The cabin was silent, but the air felt charged as if she weren't alone. She closed the diary and set it on the table beside the letters. This has to mean something, she murmured, her mind racing to piece together the clues. Childhood memories. Elizabeth glanced around, trying to recall the Christmases she had spent in the cabin. She was young, but a few images surfaced. Her grandmother smiling as she opened boxes of ornaments, her father and uncles debating which Christmas tree was the best, and most vividly, Margaret presenting each family member with a special gift wrapped in gold paper with a red bow. The tradition was always the same. Margaret would say that the gift symbolized the family's love and unity. The golden gifts, Elizabeth whispered. She always made such a point of giving them personally. Could that be what she meant in the diary? Determined to find out, she began searching the cabin. Each room felt both familiar and mysterious. The kitchen, once warm and filled with the aroma of cookies and cider, was now icy and still. The hallway leading to the bedrooms seemed narrower, as if time had shrunk it. But the main living room, with the fire still crackling, remained the heart of the place. The chest of memories. As she rummaged through the furniture, Elizabeth found something she hadn't seen since her childhood. A small wooden chest that used to sit at the base of the Christmas tree. The chest was dusty but intact, with an old, rusted lock. She remembered her grandmother saying, "What's inside this chest is more important than any gift. It holds the essence of who we are." At the time, Elizabeth had thought it was just one of Margaret's cryptic sayings. Now it felt like a puzzle she was meant to solve. Elizabeth tried to open the chest, but it was locked. Feeling the weight of the key she had found by the lake, she pulled it from her coat pocket and tested it in the lock. The key fit perfectly, clicking softly as she turned it. Inside the chest was a single golden box, just like the gifts Margaret used to give. The red ribbon was frayed but still intact. When Elizabeth opened it, she found something unexpected. A glass orb containing a miniature version of the cabin, surrounded by snow-covered pines. When she shook it, white flakes swirled, creating a serene yet melancholic scene. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note in Margaret's elegant script. "This gift holds our memories and the power to reunite what has been broken. Use it wisely, for it can only be used once. The call beneath the snow. As Elizabeth held the gift, she heard the sound of footsteps again, closer this time. The deliberate crunch of snow made her heart race. She placed the orb back into the box and rushed to the window. The figure she had seen by the lake now stood on the porch, motionless. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. The silhouette was vaguely familiar, but shadows obscured the face, making it impossible to identify. "Who's there?" she shouted, trying to mask the fear in her voice. There was no reply. The figure lingered for a few seconds before slowly fading away, as if dissolving into the cold night air. Elizabeth took a deep breath, struggling to steady herself. The glass orb in her hands felt warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly as though it held a power she couldn't yet comprehend. She knew this was more than a simple ornament. It was the key, a connection to her family, their memories, and the Christmas they had lost. Elizabeth realized that whatever had been broken could still be mended, but the answer lay in uncovering the truth behind the gift and the cabin's secrets. The time had come to face the past and find a way to bring her family back together. The tree and the decision. Elizabeth remembered the Christmas tree that always stood at the center of the room. There was something magical about how Margaret decorated it, as though every ornament had a purpose. Now the room felt incomplete without it. She decided to search for the tree in the attic, where she knew the old decorations were stored. The attic was dark and cold, but not as intimidating as she had expected. Elizabeth found the tree tucked in a corner, covered with a tarp. It was smaller than she remembered, but still charming. Next to it was a box of ornaments. She carefully carried both downstairs. Once the tree was set up in the center of the room and its lights softly flickered, Elizabeth held the glass orb again. Something inside it seemed to glow more brightly as she brought it closer to the tree. She recalled the words on the note. It can only be used once. But how? What exactly was she supposed to do? Sitting in front of the tree, Elizabeth held the orb in both hands and closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother, her family, and the joyful moments they had shared in the cabin. She reflected on the words from the letters, Margaret's diary, and the promise to keep the family united. Suddenly, the orb began to glow intensely, filling the room with a golden light. The air around her grew warmer, and Elizabeth felt a presence so familiar it brought tears to her eyes. When she opened her eyes, she heard a soft laugh that made her freeze. "Elizabeth," said a calm, gentle voice. "You came." The encounter with the past. The room was bathed in a golden light that seemed to emanate directly from the glass orb in Elizabeth's hands. Her grandmother, Margaret, stood beside the Christmas tree, smiling as she always had. The sight was so vivid, so real, it felt impossible. The sweet smell of freshly baked cookies and the comforting warmth of the cabin filled the air, as if Elizabeth had been transported to a Christmas long past. "Grandma?" Elizabeth whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Margaret's smile was gentle, her eyes shimmering with warmth. "You've done what no one else could, my dear. You've brought the spirit of Christmas back to this place." Elizabeth took a step forward but hesitated. "How is this possible? You disappeared?" Margaret nodded, a touch of sadness in her expression. "I didn't disappear. I was taken by something greater, something you're beginning to understand. Christmas is more than lights and presents. It's a bridge between what was and what still can be. And this cabin, it has always been the heart of that bridge. A moment of revelation." Elizabeth clutched the orb tightly, her tears falling freely. "I've missed you so much. And our family, we've fallen apart." Margaret's expression softened even more as she stepped closer. "I know, Elizabeth. That's why you're here. This orb, this cabin, they hold the memories and the love we built together. But it takes someone with an open heart to awaken it. That's why you found the letters, the diary, the gift. They were meant to guide you back to what matters most." Elizabeth looked at the glowing orb in her hands. "How can I fix this? How can I bring everyone back together?" Margaret placed a hand over Elizabeth's. "By sharing what you found. By reminding them of what we once had, and what we can have again. But remember, it won't be easy. Healing takes time, but you've already taken the first step by coming here." As Margaret spoke, the golden light began to pulse gently, spreading warmth through the room. The tree sparkled with renewed brilliance, as if reflecting the love that had once filled the cabin. "The Christmas spirit isn't just in this place, Elizabeth," Margaret said. "It's in you. And when you take it back to your family, they'll feel it too. That's the true gift." Elizabeth nodded, the weight of understanding settling over her. She reached out to touch her grandmother's hand, but as soon as she did, Margaret began to fade, her smile lingering as the golden light surrounded her. "I'm always with you," Margaret whispered before disappearing completely. Elizabeth sat in the glow of the tree, the orb still warm in her hands. She knew what she had to do. This Christmas she would bring her family back together and remind them of the love and memories that had always defined them. The spirit of Christmas wasn't lost, it had just been waiting to be found. The truths revealed. Elizabeth sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the Christmas tree as Margaret knelt beside her. "What happened that night?" Elizabeth asked. "No one ever talks about it. All I know is you disappeared and our family was never the same." Margaret sighed, placing a gentle hand over Elizabeth's. "That night I realized our family was falling apart. Your uncles were arguing over trivial matters, your father was withdrawing, and I knew that if I didn't do something, everything we had built would be lost. I asked Christmas, the true spirit of Christmas, for help. And the cabin answered." Elizabeth frowned. "The cabin?" Margaret smiled warmly. "It's special, my dear. It always has been. It's a portal to our memories, to what binds us. But that year, the weight of resentment was greater than the spirit the cabin could hold. I was left here, trapped between the past and the present, waiting for someone to come and bring our family back together." Elizabeth felt a knot in her stomach. "And now, how can I help? You're here, but you don't seem complete." Margaret's gaze shifted to the glowing glass orb in Elizabeth's hands. "This gift holds the power to mend what has been broken, but it requires a sacrifice. You must choose, Elizabeth. You can use it to bring me back fully, or to restore our family and the Christmas they've lost. The weight of the choice." The room fell silent as Elizabeth processed her grandmother's words. Bringing Margaret back would be the fulfillment of a dream, but what about her family? She knew they were still distant, trapped in their own pain and resentment. Restoring Christmas meant giving them all a chance to reconnect. "What happens if I choose to restore Christmas?" Elizabeth asked. Margaret smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "You will bring the light back to everyone. They will feel the spirit they've forgotten, and it might be enough to heal the wounds. But it means I won't be able to stay." Elizabeth's tears streamed down her face. "And if I choose you? Then you and I will have the Christmas we always dreamed of, but the family will remain as it is. The traditions will stay lost and the cabin will lose its strength." Elizabeth looked at the orb, now glowing so intensely it was almost blinding. The choice was impossible, but it had to be made. The decision. Elizabeth took a deep breath and looked into her grandmother's eyes. "You always said Christmas was about unity, about bringing people back to what matters. If I choose to restore Christmas, they'll have a chance to fix what's been broken. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" Margaret nodded, though tears now streamed freely down her face. "Yes, my dear. You've understood. You've always understood." With trembling hands, Elizabeth lifted the glass orb above the Christmas tree and closed her eyes. She thought of all the joyful moments she had shared with her grandmother and her family in the cabin. She thought of the laughter, the songs, the scent of pine mixed with the warmth of the fire. And then she let the spirit of Christmas do its work. Christmas restored. The orb's light burst forth, flooding the cabin with golden warmth. Elizabeth felt a wave of peace wash over her as memories, both joyful and bittersweet, seemed to dance around the room. The tree sparkled brilliantly, and the air filled with the scent of cinnamon, pine, and freshly baked cookies. Margaret's figure began to fade, but her smile remained radiant. "You've made the right choice, Elizabeth. You've given them the gift they needed most. And I will always be with you." Elizabeth reached out, her heart aching, but Margaret was already gone, leaving only the faintest echo of her laughter. The golden light slowly dimmed, leaving the cabin aglow with the soft flicker of the Christmas tree lights. Elizabeth sat quietly, the orb now dim and cool in her hands, knowing she had made the choice her grandmother would have wanted. A new beginning. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to the sound of voices outside the cabin. Peering out the window, she saw her father and uncles standing by the lake, their expressions lighter than she had seen in years. Somehow they had felt the call to return. As they entered the cabin, a sense of wonder filled the air. They marveled at the tree, the warmth, and the familiar yet magical feeling that surrounded them. For the first time in years, the family sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. And though Margaret wasn't physically there, her presence was unmistakable. Elizabeth knew the journey wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. The spirit of Christmas had been restored, and with it, the hope that their family could heal. The cabin had once again become what it was always meant to be, a place where love, memories, and togetherness could thrive. The Christmas miracle. The orb exploded in a radiant golden light, filling the cabin and spilling into the quiet night. Elizabeth felt a surge of warmth, as though she were being embraced by all the memories she held dear. When the light faded, she opened her eyes to find that Margaret was gone. The glass orb, now dim, rested quietly in her hands. For a moment, silence returned. But then the sound of laughter and cheerful voices echoed from outside. Elizabeth ran to the window and froze, speechless. Her family, all together, was walking toward the cabin with warm smiles and eyes sparkling with emotion. She stepped outside to greet them, and before she could speak, her father pulled her into a tight hug. "I felt like I needed to be here," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "Something called us back." Elizabeth nodded, barely able to hold back her own tears as she looked at the familiar faces. They were together again, and for the first time in years, it felt like the spirit of Christmas had truly returned. The spirit of the cabin. That night, the cabin was alive with laughter, stories, and the joy Elizabeth had thought was lost forever. She glanced at the Christmas tree and felt Margaret's presence as though she were there, watching with her gentle smile. When the clock struck midnight, Elizabeth stepped out onto the porch and gazed up at the starlit sky. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered, sensing her presence beside her. A morning of peace. Christmas morning dawned with a special glow over Everpine. Snow fell softly, blanketing the landscape in a serene hush, while the cabin by the lake seemed more alive than ever. The scent of fresh coffee and gingerbread cookies filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation that echoed from the living room. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, arranging a tray of hot cocoa and cookies. Though the cabin was bustling with life again, she felt a small, quiet absence. The sacrifice she had made the night before weighed on her heart, but she knew deep down it had been the right choice. A family reunited. As she entered the living room, she saw her family gathered around the Christmas tree, sharing stories and laughter. Her father, Tom, was seated in the armchair by the fireplace, something he hadn't done in years. In his hands, he held one of Margaret's letters, reading aloud to the room. "Promise me you will never let this disappear." Tom paused, glancing around at the faces of his siblings and their children. "She knew we needed something to remind us of what really matters," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And somehow, I think she knew Elizabeth would be the one to bring it back." All eyes turned to Elizabeth, and tears welled in her eyes as she smiled. "I just followed the signs," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I think the cabin has always been waiting for us. A special gift." As the family exchanged presents, Elizabeth remembered the golden package she had found the night before. Carefully, she unwrapped the red ribbon and opened the box. Inside, the glass orb looked different. Instead of a snowy scene of the cabin, it now displayed her family gathered around the Christmas tree, just as they were at that moment. "What is that?" Tom asked, leaning over her shoulder. "It's a gift from Grandma," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's like she's still here, reminding us that Christmas is about this, being together." Tom placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "She would be so proud of you," he said. A new beginning. As the day unfolded, the cabin was filled with the warmth of a family rediscovering their bond. The once fractured relationships now seemed to mend, softened by shared memories and the gentle reminder of what truly mattered. Though Margaret was no longer physically present, her love and legacy were unmistakably alive. The golden orb on the mantel sparkled faintly, a quiet reminder of the miracle that had brought them back together. Elizabeth knew that this was just the beginning. The spirit of Christmas wasn't confined to one day or one place. It lived in the connections they had rebuilt and the memories they would carry forward. The cabin, once again, was what it had always been meant to be, a sanctuary of love, unity, and the timeless magic of Christmas. The last presents. Later that night, as everyone had either fallen asleep or rested quietly, Elizabeth stepped onto the porch. Snow fell with an almost magical grace, glittering under the moonlight. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and gazed at the frozen lake. "You did it, Grandma," she said softly. "You brought everyone back. I hope you're at peace now." A gentle breeze swept by, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt as though she were being embraced. It was a warm, familiar sensation, reminiscent of the hugs Margaret used to give her as a child. The distant sound of bells broke the silence, and Elizabeth looked up at the starry sky. One star shone brighter than the rest, almost as if it were smiling down at her. A new beginning. The next morning, as she helped her family clean the cabin and prepare breakfast, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of energy. The creative block that had haunted her for months was gone. Her mind buzzed with ideas, not just for her writing but for life itself. She decided she would return to writing, but this time about something closer to her heart: her family, their traditions, and the magic of Christmas. It was a story she knew needed to be told. Before leaving, Elizabeth made one final visit to the attic. She retrieved her grandmother's memory chest and brought it down to the living room, determined to keep it as a symbol of what they had rediscovered. She placed it at the foot of the tree, exactly where it had always